Hey everyone, imagine it's 1783, the war is over, and a new nation is born. We're talking about the Treaty of Paris, the official agreement that ended the American Revolutionary War and recognized the United States as an independent country. On September 3, 1783, representatives from Great Britain and the United States signed this landmark treaty. Not only did it end years of brutal conflict, but it also gave the U.S. some major perks, like doubling its territory by setting the western border at the Mississippi River. Now, let's rewind a bit to set the scene. It's 1781, and things were looking grim for the British. On October 19th, their army, led by Lord Cornwallis, marched out of Yorktown, Virginia. They had just been defeated by the combined American and French forces. The British soldiers, dressed up in their best uniforms, had to surrender their weapons, and some were so emotional that they were crying. Others angrily threw down their muskets, hoping they'd break. Cornwallis didn't even show up. He claimed to be sick, so his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, had to surrender to George Washington. But Washington wasn't having it, and directed O'Hara to hand the sword over to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. Legend has it that as the British laid down their arms, the bands played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," which perfectly summed up the situation. Yorktown was a massive turning point, but at the time, no one realized just how important it was. Sure, Cornwallis surrendered, but the British Army still had strongholds in places like New York City, Charleston, and the West Indies, and they could definitely keep fighting. In fact, King George III and his Prime Minister, Lord North, were already planning the next campaign for 1782. Things weren't looking great for the Americans either. Their currency was practically worthless, the soldiers were barely getting paid, and there was even talk of mutiny. Plus, France, their biggest ally, was running out of money and couldn't afford to keep up the fight for much longer. King George figured that if he could drag the war out a little longer, the American cause would collapse on its own. But here's the thing, the British people were fed up with war. The defeat at Yorktown was the last straw, and by early 1782, Parliament had had enough. Members were tired of hearing excuses from Lord North about why things weren't going Britain's way in North America. So, when news of Cornwallis' surrender hit London, it triggered a political shakeup. In February 1782, key figures like Lord Germain and Lord Sandwich lost their jobs, and by March, Lord North himself resigned. The king even considered stepping down but was convinced not to. In North's place came Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquis of Rockingham. His faction, the Rockingham Whigs, had been against the war for a while, and with the support of influential politicians like Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke, Rockingham quickly moved to end the conflict. Even though King George despised Rockingham, he couldn't stop the new government from working toward peace. In April 1782, Rockingham sent a representative to Paris to start informal peace talks. When Rockingham died suddenly in July 1782, the Earl of Shelburne took over as Prime Minister and continued the negotiations. And after the siege of Yorktown and the shake-up in British politics, the real work of negotiating peace began in Paris. The man sent by the British to handle these discussions was Richard Oswald, a Scottish merchant with ties to America. He arrived in Paris in April 1782 and met with none other than Benjamin Franklin, who had been representing the United States in France. They had some initial talks about peace, but nothing serious could happen until Oswald received official authorization and Franklin's fellow commissioners arrived. These commissioners included John Adams, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence. Adams was still in Amsterdam at the time, securing a loan for the U.S., while Jay was coming from Spain, where he had been trying, unsuccessfully, to get Spanish recognition of American independence. Lawrence, on the other hand, had been captured by the British and was sitting in the Tower of London. Oswald actually helped get him released and sent to France. By September 1782, things were starting to move forward. Oswald finally got the green light from the British government to formally recognize American independence, which had been a huge sticking point. But even with that hurdle cleared, the negotiations dragged on. When Adams finally joined the talks in late October, there was still tension. Another British diplomat, Henry Strachey, was sent to make sure Oswald stayed in line with British interests. Strachey was tough, and he pushed back on a lot of points. But the American side, Franklin, Jay, and Adams, had become sharp diplomats after spending years in Europe seeking support for the revolution. Lawrence, meanwhile, didn't have much of a role as his health had worsened, especially after hearing about his son's death in the war. Now, with independence officially recognized, there were still major issues to settle. The biggest one? Boundaries. Franklin had hoped to get Canada, but that didn't happen. What did happen, though, was that the U.S. gained a massive amount of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, more than doubling its size. British-owned property in these territories was to be forfeited, and any areas under British military occupation were to be returned without any compensation. Both sides agreed to share access to the Mississippi River, and the Americans gained important fishing rights off Newfoundland and in the Streak, Lawrence River. But the issue of loyalists, those who had stayed loyal to Britain during the war, was tricky. The British argued that these loyalists should be compensated for their losses, but the American side was not sympathetic. They saw the loyalists as traitors and were unwilling to give them much of anything. In the end, it was agreed that the states would recommend compensation, but everyone knew that wasn't likely to happen. By November, Strachey took the draft agreement back to London to get final approval. When he returned to Paris, the treaty was finalized on November 30, 1782. The treaty itself consisted of 10 articles, with Britain formally recognizing the United States as a free and sovereign nation and outlining the new borders and rights of both nations. It even addressed things like fishing rights, the repayment of debts, and the return of prisoners of war. Here's an interesting twist. The French, who had been instrumental in helping the U.S. win the war, were furious at first. They found out that the Americans had made a deal with the British without them. But Benjamin Franklin smoothed things over, assuring the French that the deal was still preliminary, and in the end, France and Spain signed their own treaties with Britain in January 1783. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the official Treaty of Paris was signed by Franklin, Adams, Jay, and a British envoy named David Hartley. After 8 long years of war, the United States was officially independent, and the last British troops left New York in November 1783. The Treaty of Paris was generous to the U.S., but not everything was settled peacefully. Loyalists struggled to get the compensation they were promised, and the weak American currency made it hard for debtors to repay British creditors. In fact, Britain used this as an excuse to keep soldiers stationed in forts along the Great Lakes, which led to tensions that lasted until the Jay Treaty in 1794. And of course, peace wouldn't last forever. Just a few decades later, Britain and the U.S. would face off again in the War of 1812. And thanks for watching.